photographs here. Everyone have a Lightroom open? They can follow along? Okay. So find a raw file or a DNG or anything in between. Doesn't matter whether it's developed or not. And if you want to export it directly from Lightroom, fastest way to get there is the button next to the import button in the library. And yours will look different because I have a lot of presets here. Your Lightroom will have probably just two folders: the Lightroom presets, which are canned presets that they give you, or the user presets, which are the ones they expect you guys to make and store there. We'll talk about the presets separately. So if you want to export from Lightroom, you have a choice of choosing later where you want the file to be, or you can choose a specific folder before you export. I tend to choose the folder later unless I'm doing my social media exports. Those all go to a social media folder that's buried in a preset. So choosing folder later is probably the default you'll use at the beginning. If you want to rename the file, such as put duplicate or any information, you can do that here. And I have a bunch of presets here, but if I didn't, I could say I want a custom preset. It'll have the file name, and the way you get this is this way. It has a drop-down list of different things you can have done when you do a rename. Most people will want to keep the file name that's already in the file and then add something to it. Most people want to keep the original serial number of that file that the camera embeds, that 4 or 5 digit number that's always in your RAWs or in your JPEGs from your camera, and that's called the original number. So the way you build a custom naming, if you want to do it, is you hit Insert for file name, and then if you want to keep the original number suffix, you put that. And then if you want to add anything else like dupe or duplicate, or put the image size that you're exporting, so that when you look at your files, whether they're in Lightroom, Bridge, or anywhere else, you actually know what the file size is. And the reason I do that is because when I'm preparing things for handing in to clients, I give them a specific file size, and I want to see in my list of files in my folders the difference between a TIFF that's 3,000 pixels versus one that's the original 6,000 that my camera makes. So I might put down something like this, and I might put the word dupe. I've just typed it out here in caps. And all I'm doing is creating a preset, and I can then save that current setting as a new preset. If I had just hit the word done, it would have asked me to do this anyway. I'll call it 3,000 pixel dupe. And then the next time I go to use Lightroom Export, it's going to have this in the drop-down list of options. So that's why the rename is helpful for people who are doing repetitive tasks. Some of you will leave here and not go directly into any aspect of photography. You might spend some time assisting or being Digitech. Digitechs are the people who handle all the files coming out of the shoot. And so you might create a preset for that shoot or for that photographer and work that way. The most important thing is this here, and that's the file size. So this is what we're talking about. So if I ask for a 2,000 pixel, in this case I'll just put down 3,000 since it's what I titled the file. I'm choosing long edge because we're shooting either square or rectangular, and 3,000 set as the long edge is all I really need. And then you can set the resolution however you want. If you're heading to the web, you can set it at 72. If you're heading to print, you can set it to 300. The truth is this: a 3,000 pixel wide document is the same exact amount of pixels in the same file size, whether it's resolution 300 or 72. Because the measurement is how many pixels there are, not whether it's a small image with a lot of pixels per inch or whether it's a large image with very few.
Can you say that?
Yeah, it's pretty confusing. It's totally intangible. I actually have a little visual for that I can put in your folders for the week up on Dropbox. If you have a 300 pixel per inch resolution file, that's known as 300 ppi, pixels per inch, that's destined for print. Let's say you have a camera that shoots 24 megapixels. All right, that's going to put out a file of a given size. I think 24 megapixels is like 6,000 pixels by, right, yeah, right, it's 2:3 ratio, right? So if that 6,000 pixel image coming out of your camera is set to 300 ppi for print, then it's a given dimension at 300 pixels per inch, because printing requires more pixels per inch for sharpness than the web, which is screen. So when you put stuff up on the web, if you put a 3,000 pixel image up on the web, it's going to be enormous, right? What's your screen resolution? Maybe 1950 or something like that. So a 3,000 pixel image online would be this big, and you've probably seen that when you've hit the little plus sign on any image online that's really large, and it enlarges to way bigger than you can actually see, and you have to pan around to see it. So it's the same file at 72 pixels per inch. So total number of pixels is the real dimension of the file. It doesn't matter what the PPI is when you're handing files to me. If you drag a 2-inch by 3-inch file that's 3,000 pixels because it's 300 PPI, it's going to show up the same size online as it is if you take the same thing and do it at 72. It's just the number of pixels that determine that size. When it comes down to image dimension, like in inches, that's when it's a little less known. So just know that the number of pixels wide or tall, or megapixels of your image, that's going to determine how large it appears when it's printed or whether it's online. And I'll put some documents on file sizes up in your homework folder so you can access them separately from the lesson files so that you can reread through that. It's a visual, actually, and maybe I'll bring it up after this as well, after this little discussion. So back to exporting, you set your image size that you desire, and I'll be asking you to reduce your original raw files down to a palatable image size. The reason I'll ask for 3,000 pixels longest edge on some homework is so that I can zoom in and see the quality of the work, especially on masking. Other times I'll ask for maybe 2,000, and that's something that I won't need to zoom into as much. So obviously the more pixels you hand off to somebody, or the more pixels you have in your image, the larger you can print it, and that's just a standard. Some people are shooting with 50 megapixel cameras. That's obviously can produce double the file size that a 24 can. So the reason why so many people are going to these 50 megapixel and larger cameras or medium format is to be able to do really sharp large prints, especially for retail, clients, fashion, things like that. Or for me, I like having a medium format camera for when I have to do really large prints for clients or when I'm doing billboard work or anything like that. You can keep all your metadata. And the other thing I like to do at the end of the export dialog is I put show in Finder. And that way, after the export process, it brings up the Finder window and shows me my file so I can examine it if I want. I'm going to hit export. Before I hit export, I'm going to go over one more piece. The sharpen for screen or sharpen for print. If you're taking a really large file and you're crunching it down to be online, throwing away a ton of pixels, when you throw away all those pixels in order to take a 24 megapixel image and turn it into a 2 megapixel image for online or whatever it's going to be, it's going to soften a bit. As Photoshop interpolates it down, it tries to maintain sharpness, but it can't. So what they give you is a chance to do a little bit of sharpening for screen, low standard or high, or if you're going to print matte or glossy like the printers here, these Epsons, you can actually put a little bit of sharpening during the export process. If you're printing on that luster that most of these shots are going to be put out on here, are you guys using luster paper in there or using matte or both?
I think in the big ones it seems a little glossy.
Maybe it's not. Yeah, some of them are luster, some of them are called semi-matte. You're probably not printing on pure glossy because that's like a mirror finish.
No, it's the luster.
It's what?
It should be the luster, I believe.
Yeah, luster. That's a common stuff. A lot of the prints out back in that file from last quarter. So you would choose glossy paper for anything that's not dead matte, and then you could use low standard or high. And you'll know when you do it whether you like the sharpening. I wouldn't do any high sharpening because sometimes it puts gritty edges wherever you have texture. Honestly, I try to pre-sharpen my stuff, but honestly, if I'm also going to take really large files that I've created in composites and crunch them down for online, then I will use this sharpening here. So let's say I'm doing an export and okay, you're taking a file that you've got in Lightroom. It can even be a Photoshop file that round-tripped back to Lightroom, and you want to export it through Lightroom to save time rather than opening it up in Photoshop and going to export. You can make a preset so that you automate the process going forward, and that's why I have all these presets here. My website's built on the Photofolio platform, so I call it APF, and these are my horizontal and vertical image presets for getting these photos set up for me to upload onto my website. So I made a folder, and then I made presets within it. Most of the time, all you'll need to do is save your presets into the user folder. So this isn't what I was going to show you right now, and I can give you some printed workflow on this so that you'll remember it. But as long as we're in this place, and I've set up something that I consider to be a pretty good workflow for exporting from Lightroom. I'll also mention that you've got control whether you want to export as a TIFF, JPEG, PSD, or whatever. You can even export as a DNG, but it's not like you're going from your raw file to exactly the same thing. But it will export a DNG. That will open up in Adobe Camera Raw. So if I'm just exporting a JPEG or I've asked you for TIFF, then it's going to look like this. You'll choose your color space, and I think for this class, even if you shoot in ProPhoto RGB, you can give me ProPhoto or you can give me Adobe RGB. If you're going online, you won't want to choose either of those because they can come out funky online. The web has a way of stripping away the quality of color photos. As you've noticed, if you've uploaded stuff to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, it doesn't look quite exactly like the file you thought you were uploading. So sRGB is a better choice for that. And then this is where you change it down to 8-bit. And this is where you choose the compression, which I'm asking you to do so that file sizes are smaller. That's all in file settings here. Once you've set up all of that and you want to save it as a preset, you just go to Add under the preset window. Call it whatever you want. I'll call it 3000 pix sRGB. And maybe LS for low sharpening or anything I wanted to put in there. It's helpful to name your preset exactly what it does. And just drop it in user presets unless you want to make a new folder as I have over here. I'll hit create and it made a new preset. So that was a long way of describing how to use Lightroom for exporting, but I gave you all the mechanics of creating exports of any file size and file type you want, as well as creating a preset. I'm going to hit export now. It's going to make the file. First it's asking me where I want to put it. I'm just going to put it on my desktop for now. It crunches it out. It shows me that it's working. And then it opens up that folder where it put the file and actually highlights it. So that if I want to check it by hitting the space bar, whoops, can't have the name selected, I can check to make sure it's what I want. Or I can open it up by double-clicking it. So when I ask you for an LZW compressed TIFF, that's what I'm talking about here, 8-bit and LZW compressed. By doing TIFFs instead of PSDs, the files are automatically smaller. If you want to export as JPEG, same thing. Choose sRGB. This is your quality level. You all know about JPEGs versus other file types in terms of what you get. I'm sure Jason told you about JPEGs. They lose quality because they use a lot of compression. But you have a choice of how much quality you get from them. Like if you put the quality all the way up to 100%, I actually hand in my client files that way a lot. I'm not giving them my layered file, and a lot of them, up until recently, couldn't handle the TIFFs on their servers. So they got, I don't know, if I did a 30 by 40 poster and gave them 100% quality JPEG in Adobe RGB, that's a completely printable file. I never give them 16-bit files unless someone from their production team specifically asks for it. If you're going to set up an export for JPEGs, then make a preset for that too. So I'll just follow that up by saying, here's an online JPEG I might do. I set it to JPEG sRGB in a quality somewhere around maybe 80% or 80. I think when you do it in Photoshop, it might have single numbers like 8, like 1 through 12. And then I'll just make another preset. I might say web so I can see it. sRGB. And there's that preset too. So the benefit of the preset is from now on, when you want to do the same thing, you just grab the preset and then it'll fill in all the things on the right for you here. Remember though that a preset's also going to remember this. So if you put a specific folder in, it's going to remember what folder to put it in. And that's one of the reasons why people get confused is they have this set to a specific folder. It's going to go down to the desktop. So there it is. So there's the JPEG and there's the TIFF. File size of the TIFF is 8.4 megs. File size of the JPEGs is 1.5. Why should you care? Because your TIFFs are always going to be much larger, often much, much larger than this because I made a small one. What happens if you view these files online? Let's find out. This will give you a little bit better illustration of file size difference. All right, so that's the 3000 pixel JPEG. Notice it's got this little magnifying glass. So that's the full 3000 pixels online. I'll make another window and drag in the TIFF. Different file sizes. exact same online because they're both 3,000 pixels. So whatever dimension your image is in pixels is the way it's going to show up in any medium that it's printed in or put online. So you're more concerned with dimensions when you're ordering your prints. You guys do your own printing in the lab over here, right? Okay. So you want to print a 13 by 19, then you can size your image to 13 by 19 at, what were you told to give it in terms of pixels per inch? 300 is kind of a standard, even though the Epson may not care. So that's the only time you need to really think about the dimensions, is how it's going to fit the usage you're doing. You can always do the sizing in the lab on the computer, right? You've got that processing software that lets you choose size there. You can do it at that point and then just feed it your whole image and not worry about that. But when you work for a studio, if you ever do any Digitech for a studio, they might be asking for certain file sizes. You'll need to do that either from Lightroom or from Photoshop. Let's get a break now. Let's come back at 11. And I'll shut the recording down.